Welcome to the third in this series of reflections on the book of Romans in association with Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, Santa Barbara, California. We've been going through one chapter of Romans per week, and so now we're on chapter 3. This past Sunday, in our worship service, we heard Romans chapter 3, the last part, or the second part of Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 31. And we also heard part of Matthew chapter 11. And as I've said before, that was integrated into a liturgy, including singing and music, a psalm and prayer and so forth. We're not able to, or we're not intending to reproduce that context here. But as I've also said before, we are under mercy hearing and responding to the same word of God. So on Sunday, we heard the latter part, the second part of Romans chapter 3, skipping over the first 20 verses. We did that partially because, as many people know, in that latter part of Romans chapter 3, starting from verse 21, these huge ideas like righteousness and justification and faith, they make their big stage entrance. There's a transition, there's a turning point. And it would have been a travesty not to think about that together on a Sunday. But we also skipped over verses 1 through 20 partially because it's hard. It's hard to cover an entire chapter of a text as dense and as rich as Romans within the space of one Sunday worship service. But now we have an opportunity to make good on that. We have an opportunity to return to consider verses 1 through 20 of Romans chapter 3, and that's what I'm intending to do today. Before doing that, I would like to cast a glance back at where we've come from. Romans chapters 1 and 2. As we know, the Apostle Paul, developing his argument, the argument that goes throughout the book of Romans, developing it in this first part of Romans chapters 1 and 2 by making allusions to some background material that he could assume that his readers, that his eventual readers and hearers would at some level agree with. He made allusions in chapter 1, as I mentioned in the first video, to the idea of God's creating the world, and to the notion of a human nature, a nature that is given to us, that has built in, so to speak, a purpose for human beings that we don't simply construct or make ourselves. In chapter 2, as I said in the second video, Paul alludes to the history of Israel, and not just sort of a secular accounting of events, but the idea that God is in a special relationship, a relationship of calling, of election with this specific people, with this specific group, the Jews. Now, as we sit back and we think about this development, the development of this argument, we realize that these are big claims. These are not trivial, to say that God created the world, or that human beings have a nature, or that Israel is the chosen people. These are big claims. And in this context, as I just mentioned, Paul can perhaps simply assume that his readers will agree with him. Maybe he had to defend, maybe he had to explain them somewhere else to other groups, but here he doesn't have to. In reading Romans chapters 1 and 2, it strikes me that in our context, in the 21st century, in the context in which Christians and the church live, as we are attempting in obedience to proclaim, to bear witness to the same gospel, we don't have the luxury of assuming agreement. We don't have the luxury of simply being able to say these big background claims, which for Paul are essential to the development of his argument, to the development of his presentation of the gospel. But we don't have the luxury of simply assuming that we will get agreement on these. In fact, we don't even have the luxury of assuming that we'll be able to, given the opportunity, to argue for them. We bear witness to the gospel within a culture which leans toward thinking, and not just thinking, but simply simply assuming that there's no transcendent, no common reality, no truth that stands above us and that calls for our conformity to it. Certainly not anything like God created the world, or there is a normative, there is a human nature that we are called to live into. We bear witness as Christians, as the church. We bear witness to the gospel within a culture which, even if it's ignorant, completely ignorant of the actual decision, it takes Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy's notorious words, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life," takes those words, that idea that we can simply define our own meaning, define what human life is all about, define what the universe is all about. It takes those words as not even needing to be argued, and therefore as an obvious blueprint for society. It applies this. We live within a culture that applies this notion to our bodies, our sexuality, our humanity, our relation to creation, to the world. And in such a situation, even trying to talk about God's created design or a given human nature, or the election of a particular people to which all other nations and all other peoples are somehow to be coordinated, talk like that is ignored or violently attacked and canceled. Now, this notion, given classic expression by Justice Anthony Kennedy, is crazy in a dangerous way. Because if the truth, if the reality that is around us is not something that is independent of us, that is not something that we get to simply define, which we can perhaps argue about, but that we are called to come together to see, if it's instead something that we can just make up to be whatever we individually want or desire, then how do we do anything together? How do we come together at all? In other words, how do we form a society? How do we do politics? How do we come up with law? Eventually, the answer is simple. Those with more power, more sheer, aggressive, forceful power, can compel, can coerce others to do what the powerful want. Now, this is the insight behind a recent observation by the Catholic theologian R.R. Reno. Reno's talking here about recent Supreme Court decisions concerning sexuality, but I think the lesson here is a wider one. Here's what Reno says: "Our legal regime has repudiated the book of Genesis and the scriptural account of God as creator. This puts our law, in other words, the legal decisions and the legal framework that we're working with, this puts our law on a collision course with human nature. If we continue on this course," Reno says, "the word used to describe the legal and social reality of this collision will be totalitarianism." Now, this reminded me of something that the great Lutheran theologian Robert Jensen, way back in the 20th century, back in the last millennium, wrote. Jensen said that nihilism, the idea that we are just on our own and there's no transcendent truth or calling on us, nihilism has a motto: mastery, not truth, makes law. In other words, it's the ones with power and not the reality of the situation which determines who gets to say what has to be done. Where law fails the reality tests, in other words, where law fails to acknowledge a reality or truth beyond itself and indeed beyond everyone, which can't be changed just by saying so. I was interpolating there on Jensen, but back to Jensen. Where law fails the reality test, it is indeed but a product of dominance. And law that can claim no other justification than the decision of its makers can be maintained only by essential arbitrary power. Now, even if you think that all of that is too over pessimistic, that it's overblown, or indeed that it's too political, it remains that the Christians, the church, have been tasked with proclaiming, with bearing witness to the gospel in our time, within our culture. And if we're to take Paul's cue in the book of Romans, especially chapters 1 and 2, we cannot do that without making these big claims about reality, about a truth that transcends everyone. And we have to realize that these are claims within our context that are not just contested, they're not just denied, but they're actively, aggressively treated with contempt. And this also goes for things that are central to the gospel. Think of the way that Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says that if Christ is not risen, if the fact of Christ's resurrection is not true, if it's not reality, then our gospel is empty, our preaching is in vain. So it goes for these central components, these central tenets of the gospel, but it also goes for these background understandings like the world as God's creation and the givenness of human nature and the election of Israel. So chapters 1 and 2 continue to be important, but now we're thinking about chapter 3 of Romans, moving on, and of course remembering that originally Paul did not think in terms of chapters. He might have thought in terms of the structure of his argument, but he wasn't the one who came up with these chapter divisions there just for convenience. But perhaps before I think about the first 20 verses of Romans chapter 3, I should read them. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Oh, much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I'm speaking in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil, that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying? Their condemnation is just. What then? Are we any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Thus, the first 20 verses of chapter 3 of Romans, and of course, we recognize that this is leading into the great verse, the great second part of Romans chapter 3, where Paul makes a turn and says, but now the righteousness of God has been disclosed. Now, the feeling that I get is that these first 20 verses of Romans chapter 3 are kind of bringing the first part of Paul's argument before, as he's approaching this transition, kind of bringing the first part of this argument to a climax. And in fact, I think the form of these first 20 verses are in support of that idea that we're kind of, approaching this turn and therefore bringing this first part of the argument to a climax. You may have noticed that it's essentially a question and answer format. It's as if Paul is taking a breath after spending the first 2 chapters thinking, developing his argument, taking a breath to reflect. We all know that a lecturer, a speaker, a presenter of some topic will often take a breather and say, are there any questions? Let's think about what I've said for a bit, process it, come up with, perhaps argue about it, and then we can, on the basis of that common understanding, that achieved common understanding, move on. This first part of Romans chapter 3, although it's certainly not the only place that Paul asks questions, it certainly has that feel of stopping to reflect and saying, okay, let's summarize here. And the other interesting thing is that Paul is he's of course not live. He's not doing this to with an actual audience who can ask him questions, and so he's kind of making up the questions himself. But what that shows is what he thinks is important about what he's said, what he thinks is critical to sort of bring back and to chew on again before moving on to the rest of the argument. So the questions in chapter 3, the first 20 verses. The first one in verse 1, what advantage has the Jew? What is the value of circumcision? The second one in verse 3, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? The third question in verse 5, but if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say, that God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? The fourth question in verse 7, if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And the fifth question in verse 9, what then? Are we, and what he means here is Jews, the people of Israel, are we any better off? So these are the ways in which Paul is summarizing his argument so far and highlighting the points that he thinks need to be highlighted. I'm not going to go through every question, but I do think that it's important to think about some of these prominent things, that just really interesting and prominent things that come up in this section. So for example, the first question, of course, thinking about this whole background assumption of the election of Israel and still the fact that Jews have sinned and Gentiles have sinned. So he says, what advantage? Is there any benefit? Is there any good thing about being a Jew? And his answer is yes, they've received the very words, the oracles of God. Note that it's not something that's within them, so to speak, or within anyone, but it comes from God. That's the advantage. That's the benefit. And then the next question: what if some were unfaithful? In other words, what if some did not obey? What if some turned away from this particular relationship, from this particular calling that they had, having received the words, having received the oracles of God? What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? Now, this is intriguing to me. Why is this an interesting or important question? Why does the faithfulness of God come up for Paul as something that needs to be reflected on, that needs to be thought about, after having talked about the disobedience and the unrighteousness and the wickedness of human beings? So why is the faithfulness of God a topic that arises here? Paul is opposing here God's faithfulness to the faithlessness of human beings, and indeed is saying that the accomplishment of God's purposes is not dependent. It isn't waiting around for human beings to become become obedient and meritorious and so forth. Indeed, as he points out, even human disobedience and wickedness, by contrast, shows up God's glory. And yet that doesn't justify the sin, it doesn't justify the disobedience as if we were in some sort of end justifies the means kind of situation, where as long as sin leads to a great result like God's glory, then we should be able to do whatever we want. This will come up again in chapter 6. So God's faithfulness is opposed to and overrides and is prior and not dependent on the faithlessness of human beings. But it's even more important to realize that when Paul talks about God's faithfulness here, he is speaking of a specific faithfulness, a specific fidelity. It's God's faithfulness to Israel. It's God's keeping of his promises to the people Israel as laid out and as described in the Old Testament. It's God's commitment to truth-telling to and through this people that he chose. It's God's self-consistency in his commitment to this particular group, this people, the Jews. So when Paul talks about God's faithfulness, he is not referring to simply a kind of generic fidelity, but the specific historical faithfulness of God to this people. And that is what the gospel depends on, that God is faithful to his promises to this people, and that in Jesus Christ, as Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, in Jesus Christ we have God's yes to all his promises. And of course, God's promises to Israel were for Israel, but eventually for all the nations through Israel. It's on that particular faithfulness that the gospel depends. So it makes a lot of sense for that to come up here. There's another important observation, perhaps, to make about this idea of faithfulness. We'll have noticed already that faithfulness, faithlessness, and faith, the idea of faith, human faith, they're not only all together in this chapter of Romans, but they are similar. And that goes not only for English, the translation of these words, but also for the original. In fact, in the original, the word in verse 2, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. To be entrusted, that's also etymologically similar. It's got basically the same root as these words faith and faithlessness and faithfulness. And so we might ask, is there some sort of relationship here? Is Paul trying to make some sort of connection between the ideas of faithlessness and faithfulness? And later in chapter 3, when he talks about faith, well, he may not be trying to make a specific connection, but I think there is an understanding here that unites them. When we talk about human beings, what are they capable of? Well, what Paul spends these first 3 chapters of Romans saying is faith, basically faithlessness. Faithlessness, they're capable basically of obedience, of wickedness, of disobedience, of wickedness, unrighteousness. That's what they have in them. That's what they're up to. That's what can be expected of them. And so when it comes to faith, where can that come from? If faith is the only way by which human beings can have access to God's righteousness, as Paul says in the rest of chapter 3, if faith is the way that we perceive and recognize that Jesus Christ is the way that God has made for human beings to be saved, including Jews and Gentiles, then how is that possible? We human beings can't come up with that on our own. What even human faith can be, it has to be some sort of, it has to be dependent on, it has to come from, it has to somehow arise out of God's own faithfulness. So again, that's one important reason why this notion of God's faithfulness is coming up here. Faithfulness to his own word, faithfulness to his own power, faithfulness to his own promises, and it's from that faithfulness and from God's faithfulness alone that human beings can have faith. Later in these verses, 1 through 20, we hear the fifth question of the question of summary. What then? Are we, in other words, we Jews, are we any better off? No, no. And here's something intriguing, because Paul has said in verse 1, and he's wanted to claim that the Jews do have there's an advantage, there's a benefit, and he doesn't want that to be forgotten. That's important because it's important enough, and the notion of and the topic of God's faithfulness to the Jews is important enough so that it will come back in Romans chapter 9 through 11. But he's already said that the Jews are favored. There's something good. There's an advantage to being a Jew. And then here in verse 9 of chapter 3, the fifth question, so are we Jews any better off? And he says, no, there's no advantage here. And he's talking about two different things. Here he's talking about the righteousness, any possibility of human righteousness. And he says no, because all, both Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles, are under sin. Now, sin here, of course, a familiar word to most Christians and to the church, but it occurs for the first time in Romans, here in chapter 3, verse 9. Up till now, Romans has talked about, Paul in Romans has talked about wickedness and unrighteousness and disobedience, and he's been very explicit about specific ways in which that shows up. And now there's this kind of umbrella concept, this idea that envelops and encompasses it, all of it. And that is, of course, sin, which is sin against God, not just sort of sin as a completely random or generic concept, but sin against God. What's also interesting about the language that Paul uses here is that he says that Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles, all human beings are under sin. Now, I don't want to make too much of a preposition. Prepositions can be used in all sorts of ways. And Paul himself talks about the relationship of human beings to sin in a huge variety of ways. But it's still intriguing, it's still vivid here to get this notion that human beings are somehow under sin. The first two chapters of Romans, besides that introductory, that epistolary introduction, the first two chapters of Romans have been devoting themselves to describing how human beings are, their own minds, they let their own minds become darkened, and they turn away from worship of the living God to worship creatures, and they steal and they commit adultery on their own. They do these actions as if they were the acting powers, so to speak, the disobeyers. And yet, at the same time, here in Romans chapter 3, when he brings in the notion of sin, and of course this is not the only place where this idea of sin, this particular image of the relationship of human beings to sin comes up. We'll see it again in, for example, chapter 7. But it's dramatic here in chapter 3 when sin comes up for the first time, that human beings are said to be under, as if they were subjugated, as if they were enslaved to sin, as if they were somehow imprisoned by sin. And of course that is, again, an image that that Paul uses in other places. Finally, to think about what you might say, what you might call the main point of this sort of semi-climactic part of Romans chapter 3, bringing the argument of Romans to this particular point and then preparing for the transition to God's righteousness through Jesus Christ. You might say that the main idea here is that all human beings are subject to sin, that no one, save for, and he doesn't say it here, but in other places in the New Testament, we certainly are given this idea that Jesus, the human being, was yet not sinful. But here, Paul is concerned to talk about the universality of sin, the universality of disobedience and rebellion and unrighteousness. Another big claim, and this time, of course, foregrounded. And we will see as we move on to later chapters in Romans how that plays into how the claim of the universality of sin plays into and connects with the universality of the work of Jesus. But here, it's intriguing to me that we can hear perhaps echoes of something like this strategy, this approach, in our own times. When we hear talk of particular problems, say racism, being structural, being so pervasive, being so ingrained in society that you can see it in every nook and cranny, in every person's life, in every institution. You can maybe see a secular version of this approach, saying that everyone has this problem. Now, when it comes to racism, that may or may not be the truth, but it strikes me that there may be this. I don't know, but there may be an opening here for the Christian Paul's Christian strategy of claiming that everyone is under sin, all human beings are under sin, to at least have some traction of some sort of hearing. I don't know for sure, but in any case, whether or not the universality of the Paul's claim of the universality of sin can be more easily understood in our time, it still is an essential part of this particular way of proclaiming the gospel, and therefore something that we need to think about carefully when it comes to our own proclamation of the gospel. And for that matter, it strikes me also that the claim about the universality of sin is much more serious, much deeper than saying that any one particular problem is universal. And so the idea that the notion that whatever the problem of the day, whatever the trendy complaint of our culture in this time might be, the problem of sin runs deeper. That is also given to Christians and to the church to say, to stand fast by, as we seek to bear witness to the gospel.